Well, good morning and welcome to the 20th Annual Australian Grains Industry Conference, again being held at the Crown Promenade Hotel. I'm Stephen Thompson and will be sharing the role of MC over the next 2 days with Peter Murphy. Peter and I are partners at HFW, an international commercial law firm with 18 offices throughout the Asia Pacific, Middle East, Europe and Americas. HFW is again very pleased to be supporting AGIC Melbourne, and we have a number of our colleagues who have joined us from the Australian and Asian offices. As you will have seen from this year's conference, which is titled The Dragon, the Eagle, the Bear, the Kangaroo, we can look forward to an interesting and diverse program, with many presenters having made great efforts to travel here from overseas. We're also honoured to have 2 ministers, 1 shadow minister and a delegation from China joining us. More details as to what we can expect from AGIC 2018 will be provided by Peter Redding, Chair of Grain Trade Australia, in his formal welcome address. Peter will also introduce the Honourable Stephen Ciobo, Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, who will give the opening address. As Peter comes to the lectern, just a couple of housekeeping rules. Please ensure your mobile phones are either off or on silent. In case of an emergency, run to those exits, not those ones, and you'll probably be behind me. Anyway, Peter was appointed to the GTA board in 2012 as a director with special qualifications and assumed the role of chair following the AGM in October of that year. In addition to his role as chair of GTA, Peter is chair of the board's governance committee and a member of the audit, finance and remuneration committee. Formerly the managing director of GRDC and with previous roles at Grainpool WA, Peter has extensive experience in the agribusiness and the Australian grains industry. Other current industry roles include independent director of Batlow Apples Cooperative and a director of Botanical Resources Australia. Peter.
Thanks, Stephen. The Honourable Stephen Ciobo, Minister for Trade and Tourism, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Grain Trade Australia and our co-host Pulse Australia and the Australian Oilseeds Federation, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2018 Australian Grains Industry Conference. In addition to the Minister for Trade and Tourism, I would also like to acknowledge the participation at this year's conference of the Honourable Keith Pitt, Assistant Minister to the Deputy PM in the Transport, Infrastructure and Ports portfolio, and I notice you've just walked in, so welcome Keith. And Joel Fitzgibbon, Shadow Minister for Agriculture, will also attend the conference. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our overseas visitors who have travelled from more than 10 countries across the globe, including China, Singapore, European countries, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, New Zealand, Pakistan, Ukraine and the United States. It's a pleasure to have you all here. I'd also acknowledge and thank the many sponsors, including gold sponsors HFW and ANZ. Your support plays a critical role to the ongoing success of the conference, and I encourage everyone to visit the various sponsor booths during the next 2 days. As conference organisers, it is important to keep the conference fresh and vibrant and to ensure the technical program remains current to industry needs. For this year's conference, I'd like to highlight that the final session tomorrow will include whisky and baijiu tasting sessions. These beverages represent examples of the end-use products of Australian grain, and everyone is welcome, and I encourage you to attend that session. This year's program again highlights quality domestic and international speakers, including from politics, finance, business, science, technology and the grain communities. The combined Australian grains industry is now Australia's largest agricultural export industry and as such is a major contributor to the national economy. The industry is also benefiting from increased domestic demand. Unfortunately, as we all know, the current cropping season is presenting some very significant production challenges, particularly in New South Wales and Queensland, and our thoughts go out to those affected growers. Despite seasonal variances, the grain industry has continued to grow over the last 10 years and has evolved from a regulated environment to what is now an open, competitive, self-regulated market that delivers value along the supply chain. GTA's core mission is the facilitation of trade. This means, amongst other things, the movement of grain along the supply chain on a commercial basis and the ability for industry participants to manage and appropriately mitigate risk. GTA's trade rules, contracts and dispute resolution mechanisms are a key part of that trade facilitation. It was very gratifying to see that in a recent ACCC report on the dairy industry, the GTA dispute resolution process was highlighted to other agricultural industries as a model for them to consider adopting. I was at a Dairy Australia function a couple of weeks ago and received several questions on the industry dispute resolution process. GTA is proud of the self-regulatory framework that its products and services support, and it's particularly noteworthy that this framework is driven and developed by industry and GTA members through participation in technical committees, industry working groups and consultative committees and member submissions, real examples of the industry coming together when it needs to develop solutions. Since the last conference, GTA has revised and updated its Australian Grains Industry Code of Practice, which I should have had with me. We would like to thank all those who took part in developing or revising the code, and also to the Australian Government who provided funding and endorsed the revised code. Australia is the only major exporting nation that has such a code of practice that describes the base practices and processes to ensure quality assurance across the supply chain. This is so important for our customers who need to have confidence in the Australian grain they are buying is meeting their needs and specifications. There'll be more information about the code and the new assessment program presented during the conference. Over the past year, GTA has established an Information Technology Advisory Committee to ensure that our industry keeps pace with the rapid change in technology and how this will impact the way grain is traded. This committee, in addition to our other committees that cover standards, commerce, plant breeding innovation, transport, ports and storage, and trade and market access. In 2018, GTA, together with Australian Oilseeds Federation and Pulse Australia, led grains industry conferences in Thailand and China. Following the Thailand conference, cargoes of Australian barley were sold into the market as a direct result from information and networks that were established at that event. Participation in the Asian conference continues to grow. As part of the AGIC conference series, GTA led Australian industry delegations in roundtable discussions involving local government agencies and the trade to support the development of mutual trading interests. These were very successful and have resulted in some current encouraging development projects. I would like to again recognise the work and support of the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources, Austrade and DFAT in the industry roundtable events. We've also undertaken considerable work on behalf of members in trade and market access issues, such as non-tariff trade measures, including phytosanitary issues, chemical residues, and grain assessment harmonisation. We've been particularly active in the development of global trade policy initiatives and frameworks through our involvement in the International Grain Trade Coalition. Many of you will have seen the recent announcement that GTA and the Australian Grain Exporters Association are joining to create an Australian Grain Exporters Council within GTA. GTA was approached by the AGIC and its members to seek opportunities for efficiency gains across the industry and industry representation. The Sector Council concept was proposed by AGIC and is supported by GTA. A Sector Council provides a meeting place for an industry sector within the governance framework and administration provided by GTA. I'd like to thank and acknowledge the leadership demonstrated by AGIC's board and its president, Lyndon Asser. I'd also like to mention the work of the Australian Industry Discussion Group. Under the current chairmanship of Grain Growers Limited, a major focus has been on the allocation of the wheat industry special account funds and developing a mechanism for ongoing support for industry good functions and progressing the establishment of an industry good company. My sincere thanks to the staff for the work of GTA staff, Pat, Cheryl, Wendy, Tim and the technical consultants and all the industry participants who volunteer their time and the work of the committees and industry working groups. The strong efforts of the conference committee, and our special thanks to Rosemary Richards and Brian Hall for the work that they have done. This will be my last conference as chair of GTA. After 7 years as chairman, it's my intention to retire. The timing is right from both an industry and organisation perspective. No doubt some saying it's probably well overdue, but anyway. It has been an absolute pleasure to serve both the grains industry and GTA members. After a long due diligence recruitment process, I'm pleased to announce the GTA board has elected Mr Andrew Goyder as our new chairman. I'm very happy to be passing the role to a person of Andrew's ability and stature, literally and figuratively. I know he will provide strong leadership and guidance to GTA going forward. This conference will also bring to an end my association with the grains industry that, believe it or not, has spanned more than nearly 20 years. When I joined Grainpool in 2002, AWB still had the single desk and there were still statutory marketing arrangements in South Australia and in Western Australia. It was a fascinating time to be involved in the grains industry, with increasing agitation for grain trading deregulation and strong drivers for industry consolidation, particularly amongst the bulk handlers and traders. I vividly remember going to the Grainpool board and arguing the case that we needed to corporatise and proceed towards a merger with CBH. There were very many interesting discussions with the CBH board and others regarding deregulation and what the industry could or would look like post-deregulation. And I'm sure Wally Newman and others, Neil Wandell, will recall those discussions. As a result of those discussions, the Coal Commission, subsequent mergers, demergers, we have the vibrant industry it is today. It's probably worth reflecting very briefly on, I think, where the industry has come from since deregulation. Despite all the doomsayers and everything else, the industry has continued to grow and prosper. Crop yields and production have continued to rise despite some very challenging weather-impacted yields. This is a real credit to our farmers, researchers, and the work done by the GRDC. There have been significant increases in investments in ports and storage capacity, both on and off the farm. Growers now have many more options on how they store and they market their grain. Many of the functions that were once carried out by AWB on behalf of industry are now effectively covered by industry, including the work done by the National Working Party on Grain Protection and Wheat Quality Australia. And it's also, I think, the grower organisations work more closely together than they did in those days as well, which is good. My parting words of advice, for what they'd be worth, is to continue to focus on G by E by M by O, and that's not GMO. G for genetics. Over the past few years, we have seen amazing advances in plant genetics and their potential impacts on yield, disease resistance and quality. It is hoped that with the rapid advances in plant breeding technologies, that science, more than emotion, will drive their path to market and deliver the benefits that will flow from that technology. E stands for the environment, and its only constant is that it will continue to change, and we must ensure that industry adapts to both the challenges and, in some cases, opportunities that these changes will bring. M stands for management, and as an industry, grain has been one of the leading edge in developing and adopting world-leading managing practices, as evidenced on the farm, such things as minimum tillage, controlled traffic, as well as grain handling, grain logistics. Finally, O stands for an open and commercially driven trade environment. We have already seen the benefits of this, and we must ensure that it continues. Finally, from my own perspective, and myself and Steve Jeffries have had many interesting discussions over this, my belief the biggest challenge facing this industry will be in the years going forward is the ability to produce enough of the quality grain that will be demanded by an ever-growing world population. In conclusion, I trust you find the conference to be of great value from the high-calibre speakers and the program that it has, and also value which all these conferences deliver, and that's great networking opportunities across the industry. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the Honourable Steve Ciobo, MP, Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. The Minister is responsible for 4 government agencies in a portfolio that employs more than 7,000 officials and has a combined annual budget of $6 billion. Since becoming Trade Minister in 2016, he has concluded 4 trade agreements covering 19 countries. The trade agreements concluded or currently being negotiated cover economies that account for more than 61% of the world's GDP. Minister Ciobo is developing a single window for international trade to put technology in business at the heart of making exporting easier. Together with his Japanese and Singaporean counterparts, he is leading work on plurilateral, hadn't heard of that one before today, agreement on a digital trade, and with more than 80 members of the World Trade Organisation. As Investment Minister, Minister Ciobo works with the international investment community to promote and facilitate foreign investment in Australia. Since his appointment, the total stock of foreign investment has risen by more than $233 billion. The Minister has delivered record revenue for Tourism Australia, allowing the agency to promote Australia overseas like never before. The Australian tourism industry is welcoming a record number of tourists who are staying longer and spending more. Before entering the Australian Parliament as Federal Minister for Moncrieff in 2001, Minister Ciobo built a professional career as an executive in the Economic Reform Unit at the international firms Cooper and Lybrand and later Price Waterhouse Coopers. He holds a Bachelor of Commerce and a Bachelor of Laws from Bond University, as well as a Master of Laws from the Queensland University of Technology. In closing, Minister, the industry is appreciative of your time to address, and we look forward to your comments. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Honourable Stephen Ciobo to open the 2018 conference.
Well, good morning to all of you, and Peter, thank you very much for those warm words of welcome. And can I acknowledge Keith Pitt, who's with us this morning, and I know providing the keynote address after me this morning. But to all of you, what a pleasure it is to have the chance to come along and spend some time with you this morning. I enjoyed the chance, Peter, to wander with you and have a look at some of the exhibits, but to also know that you are, in many respects, at the leading edge of being some of the greatest Australian exporters in the room. Your industry, the output from your sector, and I think about 70% of it is exported, represents what Australia can do on the global stage with respect to putting our best foot forward when it comes to exports. $14 billion export industry. It's a terrific success, and I know many of you, maybe not all of you, but many of you are committed to open trade, the type you spoke about, Peter, in your introductory remarks, are committed to, as much as we can, ensuring that we move to a system that's free of tariffs, of quotas, of subsidies, of non-tariff measures. And I recognise that in many, many instances, you're not competing on a level playing field, and that's part of what I'm trying to address as Trade Minister, to put you on a more even footing when it comes to dealing with the world, and of course the role that we play as Chair of the Cairns Group, among other important advocacy work that the Australian Government does in this space. Peter, I'm sorry to hear that you're standing aside as Chairman. No doubt looking forward to, I'm not sure if it's retirement from Grains or retirement across the board, but in whatever form or shape that takes, I just want to commend you on the work that you've done. And Andrew, as the incoming Chair, you look like a big bloke, mate. I can just see from you sitting there, but maybe you'll lose a couple of inches with the burden of responsibility, but we'll see. But I look forward to working closely with you going forward as well. So thank you. I want to outline with you today several things, but in particular, I wanted to speak a little bit about the Coalition's agenda with respect to trade, because we've embarked on the most ambitious trade agenda in Australia's history. And in essence, we want to create a framework where export-oriented competitive sectors, like your sector, the grain sector, can succeed and can prosper in global markets. And in respect of this morning I intend to touch on three broad themes. I'd like to outline to you the broad trade strategy that we're prosecuting to create more opportunities for Australian exporters, to create economic growth, to create jobs for Australians, especially with respect to regional Australia. I'd also like to talk about how that agenda is delivering in terms of the grain sector and highlight areas where we clearly have more work to do. And third, I'd like to touch on our strategy to work with others to rejuvenate the global trading system globally, in particular, of course, through the important work that the World Trade Organisation does. Without a well-functioning, rules-based trading system, key exporting sectors like your sector, the grain sector, will be disadvantaged. So, ladies and gentlemen, over the last year or so, global trade policy developments have made more headlines than probably is desirable. And some commentators, even some of my counterparts in other nations, seem to be paralysed by the spectacle of what we've seen taking place globally. Australia's response, though, I think it's fair to say, has been very different. Our focus has been to intensify our work on securing rules-based, market-opening deals with a wide range of our most important trading partners. And the last few weeks provides a good example of the scale and the breadth of the trade agenda that I'm pursuing on behalf of our nation. Last week I was in Mexico, meeting with my ministerial counterparts from the Pacific Alliance countries of Colombia, Mexico, Chile and Peru. And a few days earlier, I'd met with my British colleague Liam Fox in London to talk about the prospect of a free trade deal with the UK after it concludes its exit from the European Union. A fortnight ago, Australian negotiators met with counterparts from Hong Kong, to work through the last phase of talks on a bilateral free trade agreement between Hong Kong and Australia. And at the same time, we had the meeting of officials from the 11 members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership who were discussing the progress to ratification, we hope, by the end of the year with respect to the TPP-11. Just several weeks ago, our officials had the first round of talks with the European Union. And in early July, I had very productive discussions with my counterpart, Indonesia's Trade Minister Enggar, on finalising a bilateral comprehensive economic cooperation agreement between Australia and Indonesia. Last week, Australian negotiators met their counterparts from 15 other regional economies to make a push toward the conclusion of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So while most of the global headlines on trade focus on the tit-for-tat escalation of tensions between some of the world's largest economies, Australia is going about its work quietly but very deliberately to implement an ambitious and comprehensive strategy to secure the interests of Australian households, exporters and sectors like yours with respect to access to global markets. And as the rules-based trading system comes under pressure from above, we are carefully crafted together a network of binding trade relationships from the ground up. And the scale of this effort, I think, is fairly remarkable. The Coalition has concluded or is undertaking free trade talks with countries that account for around $55 trillion in terms of combined GDP. Our agenda will give goods and services access for exporters, tariff-free or preferential access to a market of around 3.65 billion consumers. And most of those market opening deals have been done with the fastest growing economies in the world. Arguably, I would say this has been the most productive period in trade policy in Australia's economic history. And since the Coalition was elected, the coverage of our free trade agreements has increased from 26.4% to now nearly 70% of our two-way trade. And by the time the current round of negotiations are concluded, we'll have locked in binding rules-based commitments with countries that account for more than 88% of our two-way trade. This, in my view, is the most effective hedge on an open trading economy like Australia can possibly have against the forces of protectionism. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to note that this agenda has made good progress in opening markets for agricultural exporters, including for your sector. We've made good progress on tariff and access issues with our 3 North Asian free trade agreements. The TPP-11 has built on these gains again by securing the elimination of Canada's wheat tariffs on entry into force and the phasing of Mexico's tariffs on wheat from 67% to 0 over the next decade. Now, I recognise and acknowledge that we didn't secure everything that we wanted in these agreements. Our current FTA is under negotiation, and the reviews of existing deals will provide further opportunity to expand the sector's market access in growing markets in the future. I'm certainly pleased with the progress that we're making with Indonesia on a high-quality comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, or what we call AGIC. It'll provide greater certainty and access for Australian feed grains. It's one of my central ambitions with respect to AGIC and in terms of the market access package that we're trying to put together. We've also been discussing the idea of a partnership on grains with Indonesia as part of the economic cooperation package that we've been discussing with them. This offers the potential for deeper industry partnership, helping to cement Australia as Indonesia's preferred grain supplier. We'll also do what we can to make some gains in the RCEP agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership negotiations which are underway, ASEAN plus 6 nations, the Pacific Alliance and the scheduled review of the existing deals that we have in place. We'll be looking for significant gains on agriculture in the negotiations that we're having with the European Union as part of the EU-Australia FTA negotiations. I continue to find it hard to believe that Australia, with a population of 25 million people, imports more agricultural goods from the European Union than the EU, with 510 million people, imports from Australia. And I look forward to also making sure that our FTAs make it easier for the sector to secure more opportunities as we go about with additional negotiations into the future. And the reason is because market access gains are necessary but they're not always sufficient to ensure fair access to a market, and I recognise that. And that's because while Australian exporters continue to confront non-tariff measures in key markets, you as a sector recognise that these barriers still exist, perhaps better than most others. And I commend the sector for its recent study which found that non-tariff measures affect all categories of grain exports and are particularly prevalent in the wheat, barley and canola sectors. The report found that these NTMs, non-tariff measures, can take the form of technical and biosecurity issues including maximum residue limits, distribution restrictions, licensing or quota systems, price control measures and technical standards issues. None of these issues are easy to resolve, but they can effectively block our trade ambitions and our aspirations with respect to exports from the sector. That's why the government is stepping up our efforts to tackle these barriers. And these efforts will include streamlined reporting of the barriers and better and faster coordination of government and industry efforts in order to address these barriers. We want to ensure that our exporters operate under a trading system that is fair and transparent, and will work with the grain sector in order to be able to achieve this goal. You also won't be surprised to hear that I'd like to say a few words about India. Now, as your sector knows just about better than anyone, Australian farm exporters to India have been whacked with a range of new trade distortions over the past 6 to 12 months. It's included higher tariffs on chickpeas, wheat and lentils, quantitative restrictions on mung beans and yellow peas, and what we consider export subsidies on sugar. These are profoundly disappointing developments. They have had and will continue to have an adverse impact in terms of Australia's producers. Now, I've expressed in the clearest terms possible to the Indian government at the highest levels our concerns with respect to these developments. And when I met with my counterpart from India, Suresh Prabhu, in late June here in Australia, I signalled that the government is determined to vigorously defend our interests and your interests as producers, and we will look at WTO consistency with respect to a number of these recent measures. Now, some of their actions are within WTO rules, but there are real doubts about other measures, and we're working closely with your industry and with other affected trading partners to evaluate what our prospects are for a successful challenge. In my meetings with Indian counterparts, I've stressed that while Australia is well placed to help meet India's growing food needs, Australian exporters require certainty to enable further investment to expand and grow exports to the Indian market. I've also highlighted that the Indian agricultural sector has nothing to fear from Australian exports. The fact is that the demand for food products in India, including grains and pulses, will outstrip supply by a wide margin. And it's one of the reasons why we retain the ambition to conclude a bilateral FTA or Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement with India. But unfortunately, these negotiations have been stalled because our positions have been too far apart. Our ambition at this point in time remains far higher than India's ambition. But that said, my Indian counterpart, Minister Prabhu, and I had a promising discussion in late June, and he undertook to bring forward new proposals, a new offer, in order to rejuvenate the negotiations. But the fact is that an FTA with India will only be possible if it delivers commercially meaningful gains. And in the interim, as a government, we've been looking at ways beyond free trade agreements to expand our bilateral economic relationship with India. And that's why the Prime Minister and I asked Peter Varghese, the former Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and a former High Commissioner to India, to prepare an independent report on ways in which we can build that economic relationship between Australia and India out to 2035. This report was launched a couple of weeks ago and presents a clear-eyed assessment of the opportunities and the challenges of trading with and investing in India. And the report identifies agribusiness as one of the lead sectors out of the 10 that have been identified and provides practical recommendations on how and where we can advance Australia's commercial interests. It includes, for example, the establishment of an Australia-India food partnership with an international agricultural services hub to package Australian policy, implementation and services expertise to the Indian market. There's much in this report, and I commend it to you to look at the opportunities that exist for your sector with respect to India. The Australian government is now developing its response to the strategy, and I would welcome views from your sector. We'll continue to engage with the Indian government at senior levels. But I'd also like to refer to the recent US announcement of a new package of up to $12 billion in assistance for US farmers. The package responds to the impacts of the trade retaliation against US tariff increases and highlights the fact that escalating tariffs is in fact a vicious cycle. As I've said on numerous occasions publicly, a trade war simply has no winners. And I note that this is a view that's been shared by, for example, respected US Congressman Senator John Thune when he said that the US taxpayers will be asked to write cheques to farmers in lieu of having a trade policy that actually opens and expands more markets. Now, we're seeking more details from the US about the assistance package in order to assess possible impacts on Australian farmers and its consequent impact on commodity exports. And we urge all members, and I take this opportunity again to reinforce that all members should work within existing WTO frameworks in order to resolve disagreements. So, ladies and gentlemen, the grain sector, like all Australian export sectors, has a very big stake in a well-functioning, rules-based global trading system. Some critics argue that Australia's FTA strategy means we're forsaking this global multilateral system. But that's completely wrong. In fact, the opposite is true. Our ambition is to take the best elements of our high-quality FTAs to the multilateral system. Take, for example, what we were able to achieve under the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, including state-of-the-art commitments on electronic commerce. We want more countries to adopt these disciplines, which will keep the veins of global trade open and ensure the world embraces more digital trade as it increasingly will become the platform of choice. In this way, our FTAs are strengthening, not weakening the multilateral system. We also recognise that there is a strong case for reform of the World Trade Organisation. Of course, all international organisations need to be constantly reviewed and made more efficient and responsive. There's always scope for improvement. The WTO is no different, and for that reason, we've always been supportive of discussions on improving WTO rules. For this reason, we're working closely with key trading partners to develop practical initiatives to improve the functioning of the system. The WTO, as we all know, can move very slowly at times. The former head of the WTO, Mike Moore, once likened the decision-making progress amongst the WTO membership to a motor vehicle which has 144 handbrakes but only one accelerator. More specifically, we need to ensure the WTO is capable of resolving disputes much more quickly and efficiently. And after the disappointment of the Doha round, it's also imperative that we demonstrate that WTO can work as a negotiating body. The negotiating pillar is needed to set and update rules and to ensure that we continue to see globally more open access to markets. The government believes a strong multilateral trading system is essential for economic stability and for global prosperity. And a trading system that's based on a might is right rather than an agreed set of rules will not suit Australian exporters, including your sector. So in closing, can I thank you for your efforts in support of a strong Australian economy? Australia is a great trading nation and your sector is a major part of our success with respect to our export performance. The progress that we've been able to achieve over the past 5 years in opening new markets has been good for our country. It's been very important for economic growth for our country, and of course it's been good for jobs in Australia, especially those in regional areas. I certainly look forward to working closely with your industry over the months and years ahead, and I hope to ensure that we can continue to enjoy terrific success by opening up more market opportunities and by addressing very real barriers through non-tariff measures and the like to ensure that your sector, an efficient, globally competitive sector, goes from strength to strength, notwithstanding some of the economic headwinds that we see happening around the globe. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Minister. The Minister's kindly said that he will take questions from the floor, so if anyone does have some questions, please raise your hand, and we have some roving microphones. Whilst the microphones are moving around, just one quick question. China, Minister, can you provide us with some views, yours and maybe the government's, on where you see that heading?
Well, the bilateral relationship with China, notwithstanding a lot of the media commentary, is still very, very strong. We've seen over the past 12 months growth from 155 billion in terms of two-way trade to now more than 173 billion. We continue to see high levels of interest in terms of investment. Engagement has been strong. Now, that's not to say that there isn't from time to time some tribulations in terms of our bilateral relationship, but certainly as our most significant trade partner, China continues to be a very important market for us, continues to be a strong source of investment, and we continue to have a strong relationship. The challenge is, of course, where we do have differences of opinion, to recognise that each of us are sovereign nations with our own views. Australia needs to be consistent in terms of putting forward our views and respectful of China's position vis-a-vis their own sovereignty. But I think that we can appropriately address the balance that's required between the commercial relationship and some of the broader strategic and other interests that Australia is an advocate for. So I'll be leading a trade delegation to China as part of the China International Import Expo, which is happening in Shanghai in November of this year. We'll have a strong presence there, and we will continue to address non-tariff measures through the CHAFTA, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement Committee that we've got in place, because we want this market to continue to be a very strong market for Australia.
If you could please introduce yourself and...
Thank you, Chairman. Peter Wilson, AGT Foods. Minister Ciobo, thank you very much for your address, and can I congratulate you on your detailed understanding of the issues that are indeed facing the Australian grain sector, but more particularly the pulses, and more particularly from our good friends the Indians. Whilst we accept that trade wars don't have any particular winners, it would seem a reasonable position to take for Australia. I think moving $4 or $5 billion worth of coal to India annually, an opportunity to have a robust discussion with Minister Prabhu about whether or not an export tax on coal bound for India might somehow bring them to the table to talk about reduction of their import tariffs that they put on a lot of Australian products, indeed a lot of global products. But we've got to get them to the table, and I would have thought a bit of leverage might be useful.
Well, I understand the principle of what you're saying. I guess what we've got to discuss is the approach. And look, they're at the table, we're having discussions, and just to talk you through a little bit of the history as well. So the previous Trade Minister, Minister Sitharama, and I had sat down on a number of occasions, because obviously this process had commenced under former PM Abbott and PM Modi, with a view to concluding a trade agreement within 12 months. Now, clearly we're just outside of that 12-month mark, given it was several years ago, and so we've kept the discussion going. Minister Sitharaman was replaced by Minister Prabhu around the middle of last year, about 12 months ago. And the new Minister, Minister Prabhu, asked me to give him 6 months to get his feet under the desk, so to speak, which of course I was very happy to do. And he and I re-engaged earlier this year with a view to where can we get to. The simple fact of the matter is that the best we got to in terms of India's offer to us was 74% of tariff lines. In terms of market access, 74% of tariff lines. By value of trade, not much at all. So until we're able to get a substantially improved offer from India, it's going to be difficult for us to negotiate in a meaningful way. Now, recognising that, and I want to be pragmatic about this, the Prime Minister and I commissioned this report by Peter Varghese. Now, I haven't given up on any measure in terms of the bilateral deal that we might be able to do in terms of an FTA. But because our main offensive interest is in relation to agriculture, which is India's main defensive interest, and because India's main offensive interest is in relation to movement of natural persons, the ability, i.e., to secure visas and work rights and those kinds of things, which, as you all would understand, is possibly one of our main defensive interests politically, in terms of the Australian population's position, it's going to be a challenge. So the India economic strategy that Peter Varghese has put together is a critical opportunity for us to, in a very methodical way, look at ways in which we can boost the trade investment relationship between our countries without it necessarily having to be channeled through a bilateral FTA. So we'll find opportunities to open the market. We'll find opportunities to find common ground between us. And I am confident that we will find common ground that we can then both work toward in order to achieve a much stronger bilateral relationship. So I guess in essence, there's some role to be played for leverage, but I always put myself in the shoes of the other person who's sitting down opposite me to work out where they're coming from, and they would have a particular view about our unwillingness to do certain things that they want. And so we've just got to move around that. And, I think right back to my law school days when we used to have negotiations, and they used to say, well, two people can argue about an apple, but if one of you wants the skin and one of you wants the core, there's no problem. And that's what really I've got to get to. What is it that we can do together? So the economic strategy will drive that. India, importantly, Minister Prabhu committed to India undertaking an economic strategy for engagement with Australia. That, for me, will represent either end of the bridge, so to speak, and then we'll be able to build it off the back of that. So I'm not going to tell you it'll be done in 12 weeks, but what I am confident is that we'll be able to find common ground and we'll be able to improve that market. And India is one of the toughest that there is, so I'm still optimistic about where we'll get to.
Minister Ciobo, Richard Dickman, Bayer, Australia. Recognising the tremendous progress your government has made in different trade negotiations, but now you're embarking on one of the toughest with the European Union, and one of the toughest parts of that, of course, is agriculture and their NTMs. We saw a very retrograde decision last week with the European Court of Justice around plant breeding innovations, really representing, I think, of a different worldview of agriculture. One based on technology, another based on different approaches. Can you give us any idea of how you perhaps are going to resolve those really different views of what constitutes modern agriculture and
Sure.
allowing greater access for our produce?
Well, what I can say to you is, of course, this will be at the core of the negotiations, the core of the deal. In essence, there will be a view that, with respect to the negotiations, that Australia's, again, predominant offensive interest, not exclusively, but predominant offensive interest is with respect to agricultural access. And clearly the Europeans, one of the key offensive interests they'll have is with respect to geographic indicators. That tends to be where they tend to be quite forward-leaning. The reason I talk about those two is because in there somewhere is the deal. Right? We can talk about services side, and some of you are probably involved in the services industry, agricultural services, but if you look at real opportunity around investment in services, that's actually relatively more straightforward. It's always those political hotspots that are the challenging hotspots, and to your point, agriculture is one of them. So where we end up with respect to geographic indicators and agricultural access, I don't know. What I can say to you is that yes, this is going to be what we pursue, and we've had the first round of discussions, negotiations, but we'll have many more yet. So no, I'm not going to preempt where it might go, and I'm mindful that this is also an open forum, so I don't want to see all sorts of, you've only got to say that much and they'll craft a 30-paragraph story on the front page off the back of it. So we'll work through the issues there, but I just come back to, and I've made this point repeatedly, including in the European Parliament, that Australia, with 25 million people, imports roughly $4.7 or $4.8 billion worth of agricultural products. Europe, with 510 million people, imports roughly 3.6 billion. So if that doesn't speak to an uneven playing field, then I don't know what the hell does. So we're looking at it, core issue, front and centre. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Minister.